Hey everyone, another day, another handheld, with this one being the M19. The M19 is a budget-friendly vertical retro gaming handheld, currently floating around the $50-ish mark by SJGAM. The packaging is fairly simple, but doesn't give off the best first impressions given it's full of spelling mistakes and incredibly difficult to read writing. Although, to be fair, it is at least safely packaged, and we get the usual instructions and USB-C cable included, as well as the handheld itself. In terms of specs, the M19 is powered by the same RK3566 chip that we've seen in a number of these budget handhelds now. This gives us access to some, but far from all, of the Nintendo 64 and PSP game libraries. We don't have any wireless capabilities with the M19, but otherwise we've got 1GB of RAM, a 3.5-inch screen at a resolution of 640 by 480, a 3000 mAh battery, a weight of around 190 grams, and a heavily locked down flavour of emulate as its stock firmware. So, straight out of the box, the M19, especially in its transparent purple, isn't actually too bad. Straight away, you'll likely notice that the M19 has just the single joystick, a chunky D-pad and rainbow face buttons on the front, while on top we've got the toggle power switch, which is always an interesting choice, a mini HDMI output, and the micro SD slot. On the back we've got the volume buttons, which is always an interesting place to put them, and one that doesn't feel natural at all at first to press. But speaking of those interesting design choices, we've also got some almost completely flat shoulder buttons. These might have actually had a bit of potential if the case was shaped properly around them, but the way they're positioned a little bit below the natural curve of the back of the handheld makes them really difficult to find, and I was just naturally pressing the top of the curves until I got used to this layout. Anyway, moving on to the last section of the shell, underneath the handheld we've got the USB-C port and a headphone jack. So overall, while the M19 doesn't exactly have a horrendous layout, it certainly has some quirks straight out of the box. In terms of controls, as long as you don't mind a joystick top layout, the M19 doesn't fare too bad overall. The D-pad does sink a little too far into the case for my personal preference, particularly on the edges, which leaves a slight uneven travel to using the D-pad, and this meant for me that there was a bit of a learning period getting used to how the arcs work with its particular shape and travel. The joystick is the usual Switch style joystick, which you'll likely know exactly what you're getting, but I do like how it's recessed while not being restricted in any given direction. The face buttons aren't too bad. They're pretty responsive and feel nicely placed, but there does seem a very slight difference in the return travel between the buttons, which just gave them a slightly different feel overall. I didn't find this off-putting, but I did notice it. What I did find off-putting though was the position of the shoulder buttons, as my fingers naturally rested at the top of the back curve of the handheld, which meant finding the shoulder buttons was a bit of a task, and actually using them felt quite unnatural to me. This all just meant that although the basics of the M19's controls aren't outright terrible, they certainly are quirky, and the shoulder buttons especially just move it a bit too much into an unnatural feeling control scheme for me. What the M19 does have in its favour though is its size, with it coming in slightly larger than the Ambinix RG35XX Plus and slightly smaller than Powkiddy's V90 while open. These almost flat shoulder buttons and recessed joystick does make the M19 a very easily pocketable device. Following on with the quirky theme that we've seen so far with the M19 is its stock firmware. This is an incredibly locked down version of emulate, which although plays pretty well to its credit, it's just simply too locked down for its own good. It's likely that this was done with the idea of purchasing the M19 for children or those non-technically minded, which I can kind of see as a concept, but I just wish that there was some form of advanced mode toggle that you could activate somewhere, as the M19 just suffers without such a feature. The lockdown nature of the stock firmware certainly hurts the most when it locks the user out of some genuinely useful features. There's no access to RetroArch's menus in or out of games, which means you just can't access things like cheats, reconfigure any of the controls or video options. So essentially, if you don't like the out-of-the-box setup, you're stuck unless you're willing to dive into the actual physical RetroArch config files yourself. Additionally, there's some bugs present in the firmware which seem to randomly trigger, and due to its lockdown nature, you might end up in situations like I did here with the PSP emulation, where the on-screen controls just didn't toggle off, and the only way I could get them to disappear was to reset the handheld completely, where if it just wasn't locked down, I could have just toggled them off myself. The HDMI functionality works relatively seamlessly, although it is worth mentioning that if you're in-game, Emulec will restart the moment you plug in the HDMI cable. And the fact that the M19 has no wireless capabilities and no easy way to reconfigure the controls, unfortunately really restricts the potential usefulness of actually having this feature in the first place. So with all that said, I'll cut some gameplay footage now before summarising back up at the end. So overall, although the M19 isn't a horrendous handheld, it's certainly a quirky one. Its main downsides are with its lockdown stock firmware and almost completely flat shoulder buttons, somewhat hampering the overall control scheme. For those that do like to tinker and want portability over practicality, I could see how the M19 could appeal, but for the majority I would likely recommend Ambernick's RG35XX Plus over the M19. That's it for now though. Thanks so much for watching.